and welcome back to our next video for APUS history. We are tackling topic 5.8, but we're just going to do the first half here. We're looking at the military conflict of the Civil War, especially looking at mobilization and opposition. So this is part of Learning Objective I, explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. But we're really just touching on here this first key point. Both the Union and Confederacy mobilized their economies and societies to wage the war, even while facing considerable home front opposition. So we're looking at that mobilization and then that opposition that developed. So a little historical context. We're going to cover Fort Sumter, mobilization, and opposition. So your historical context is going to be the election of Abraham Lincoln. Despite Abraham Lincoln saying that he was a free soiler, he just didn't want slavery to expand into Western territories, Southern states did not believe him. They believed that an atrocity had happened with the fact that Lincoln could be elected without a single vote from the Southern states. And so we see the secession beginning in the South, starting with South Carolina. So Lincoln's first inaugural address occurred on March 4th, 1861, and here's where he specifically addresses what was happening with secession. He says, plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or despotism. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left. So basically saying allowing for the secession of Southern states is going to allow for anarchy to occur. So Fort Sumter, this is where we're going to see the first shots fired of the Civil War. So Fort Sumter is a federal fort, so still has Union soldiers there, despite the fact that it's off the harbor of South Carolina. But by April, it needs to be resupplied. So Lincoln has a choice. He needs to decide, okay, do we abandon the fort because we don't want to risk war starting by sending ships down with supplies? But if we abandon it, then we appear weak. But if we send ships with supplies down, that's likely going to be the start of the war. He decides he is going to resupply the fort with food supplies primarily, and the Confederate response then is to attack the fort prior to the arrival of the supplies. So Fort Sumter, these first shots were fired on April 12th of 1861. There were 34 hours of shots at the fort, but there were actually no casualties besides a Confederate horse. The Union troops did surrender, and this marks the start of the Civil War. Now, what's interesting here, there is a phrase that becomes reflective of the Civil War called brother against brother, where we see literally brothers that have to fight against each other on opposite sides in the Civil War, but other times it would be family members. So similarly, the Confederate commander, Beauregard, he's the one who orders the first shots. He was trained by Major Robert Anderson, and he was the commander inside the fort. So right from the beginning, we see the lines being blurred, the difficulties with relationships that happen in this war. Okay, so in response to Fort Sumter, what happens? Robert Toombs, the Confederate Secretary of State, had given this information to Jefferson Davis. He said, "The firing on that fort will inaugurate a civil war greater than any the world has yet seen. You will lose us every friend at the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest which extends from mountains to oceans. Legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." So advising Jefferson Davis against this attack on Fort Sumter, which of course did happen. After the attack, Frederick Douglass states, "What a change now greets us. The government is aroused. The dead North is alive and its divided people united. The cry now is for war, vigorous war, war to the bitter end, and war till the traitors are effectually and permanently put down." So Toombs is fearful of how the attack on Fort Sumter could unify the North. And once it happens, Frederick Douglass recognizes, Yes, that has happened, and it's a benefit for the Northern cause. So Lincoln's response is to call out 75,000 volunteers for 90 days. Clearly, as we know, this is not nearly enough. He authorizes war spending, and then he controversially suspends the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, which is kind of the rights of the body, rights to a trial once you've been arrested. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a future slide, and then really a lot more in the next lesson. And then he also convenes Congress. The response of the non-Confederate slave states, there's two. We see the secession of the Upper South. So there were some states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, that hadn't previously seceded, and now they do. But there are some border states that do not secede. So Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky. And then the western portion of Virginia is actually going to separate from Virginia and join the Union. When we think about the Union and Confederacy, it's important to be aware of some of the advantages or disadvantages that were happening. So when we look at population, we can see that the Union has a huge advantage. Just significantly more people available to fight in the war and more people available to work in the factories to produce the war materials, etc. As far as military goes, the Navy is a strong advantage for the Union. However, the Confederacy had a much stronger tradition of military history. They had more military colleges, strong generals, and so that was a huge advantage for the Confederacy. Looking at industry and agriculture, we see that there are most of the factories that are in the North, and that is going to help with firearms, locomotive production, cloth. And so we see also 65% of the farmland that is available and mostly focused on food crops in the North. And that will help in so many ways during the war. And then finally, the railroads. That ends up being such a huge factor that we'll talk about a little bit more in our next slide. So when you look at this, you can compare the North and the South, you see besides large farms, the North has the advantage in every single category. So continuing to compare the Union and Confederacy, let's look at their plans. What was going on here, their strategies. The Union plan is called the Anaconda Plan, in which they want to strangle the Southern economy. So here is an image for you from the Jungle Book, and then also your primary source map here, where the Union plan was to strangle the Southern economy by creating a naval blockade around the Southern ports. So they would not be able to export primarily cotton, and in response, get weapons or other war materials necessary from European countries. So the Anaconda Plan included the naval blockade. They also wanted to control the Mississippi River. By controlling the Mississippi River, it would essentially divide the South in two, and the states west of the Mississippi River would not be able to really participate and support the Confederacy, and then also capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond. They want to maintain the border states. If the border states had seceded, it would have increased the Southern population by 50% and also provided significantly more manufacturing for the region. And they were fighting to preserve the Union. The Confederacy has the advantage of fighting a defensive war. You can think back to what we learned about the American Revolutionary War, where that was a huge advantage for the American colonies. They hope to gain allies with Britain and France because of their dependence on American Southern cotton. And then they are also fighting for a cause. They're fighting for independence. So wartime roles and contributions, I wish that this was emphasized more in the curriculum, but unfortunately it's a very brief mention, if at all. And so what that means is that this is just a topic that you can uncover more on your own. But briefly, something that you want to note is that there's a Conscription Act that is going to draft white men into military service. Women will have increased roles both at home and in the military. So while not allowed to enlist in the military, there are camps of women who travel with the soldiers, who aid the soldiers, who provide food and medical care. Also, 400 plus women secretly served as soldiers and then also as spies, and then also maintaining the home front, work in the fields and the factories. African Americans will join the Union Army after the Second Confiscation and Militia Act, and then also after the Emancipation Proclamation. That is going to be highlighted in our next lesson. So here is a photo of one of the secret female soldiers was part of the war. And also the 54th Massachusetts, which again, I said we'll talk about in our next lesson. Okay, moving on to home front opposition. We're going to talk about the Union first. Probably the most important home front opposition you want to be aware of is the Copperheads. So these were known as Peace Democrats. So remember, Lincoln is the Republican Party. Lots of people in the North were strong Republicans. However, there were still Democrats who desired peace. They opposed the war in the North. They believed the benefits of winning were not worth the cost. Some peace Democrats wanted to actually allow the South to secede and have two separate nations. And so in some groups of these peace Democrats, of these Copperheads, they actually prevented the war effort. They tried to destroy the Union efforts instead of being supportive of the war. Additional home front opposition is going to rise due to the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. So Lincoln had removed that rights of the body, the ability to have a trial. And so Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, he's the Chief Justice that you might remember from the Dred Scott case. He challenges Lincoln's authority when John Merriman was arrested in Maryland. So he was arrested because of vocalizing opinions against the Union, and so he was arrested. And Taney basically says that this arrest is unconstitutional, illegal, and eventually Congress will step in and suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Not just Lincoln doing it, but Congress will do the same thing. And so these subsequent arrests are heavily criticized. Okay, additionally, home front opposition, another big one you want to be aware of is the draft riots. So these are related to the conscription laws that are passed, but more explicitly to the exclusion or the exemption clauses that were instilled. So Southern planters could get out of the draft if they had more than 20 enslaved persons. And you could also pay for a substitute. You could pay $300 to have someone take your place if you were drafted. And this is why it becomes known as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. So these tensions really rose to a climax in New York City. There was a 5-day riot where hundreds are killed and even more wounded. Many of these, the people targeted were African Americans. And it becomes so intense that Union soldiers who had just fought at Gettysburg had to be called in to put down the uprising. So these are some of the challenges that the Union had to deal with during the war. It would be wrong to assume that the North and the South were completely united in the cause that they were fighting. Here's an image from the New York City Draft Riots. Okay, looking at the South, the Confederacy, we're going to see some opposition by enslaved persons. So refusal to work, departure from plantations, damaging of property, and enlisting in the Union Army. So you see two images here. You see Harriet Tubman, who was a spy during the Civil War. And then I believe this is called the Ride for Liberty. You can see African Americans who are departing from the South. Another huge opposition from the Confederacy, or in the Confederacy, was the opposition to strong central government. So this is kind of the ironic part, is that the Confederacy is in favor of states' rights, but in order to win the war effort, they have to have a strong central government. And so the states end up opposing that. And so they try to get planters to grow food crops over cotton, and the planters resist that. The Confederacy tries to impress, or does impress, enslaved persons to build military fortifications, and there's resistance to that. There's confiscation of crops to feed the soldiers, anger over that. But probably most significantly is going to be the resentment of federal taxes that are imposed to pay for the war effort. So then our final home front opposition we're going to talk about is the Southern Unionists. So these are going to be kind of the opposite of the Copperheads in the North. The Southern Unionists are going to be against the secession and want to remain loyal to the Union. And so this is the best example we have is West Virginia separating from Virginia and becoming its own state as part of the Union in 1863. We see military companies established to disrupt the Confederate war effort. We see tens of thousands of people fleeing the South to join the Union Army. One specific group is the Heroes of America, who engage in guerrilla warfare against the Confederacy. And here's a quote from John Henningwood, who is a Southern Unionist. "We, the members of this secret circle, are Union men who believe that the so-called Confederacy is wrong and treasonable and know it to be tyrannical. We therefore owe it no service and will give it none voluntarily. We will use every secret means in our power to injure the Confederate cause and to aid the Union." So hopefully this helped you to understand. We didn't quite get to the factors that contribute to the Union victory, but we did touch on that first key point, which is really about the mobilization and the home front opposition that develops. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if so, please like and subscribe.